So welcome to Global Chats. I'm Corey Criswell. I'm the Chief Leadership Officer Americas for Adeption and occasional host of Global Chats. So super excited to be here. If you've not been to Global Chats before or you need a reminder, here's what we're going to do. We have a guest joining us, Griff Davenport. We're really excited to have him. Dan and I are co-hosting this session together. We are supported by Devin from the technology side. We're going to have about a 40-minute conversation with Griff. As we have this conversation with him, as questions pop up for you, please put them in the chat, because after our conversation and the questions that Dan and I have, then we're going to go to your questions. What are you curious about? What do you want to hear more about? And then we'll talk a little bit about what is coming next. So I mentioned that I'm excited that Griff is here today, and I'm excited because he's gonna give us insight into the friction of leadership transitions. That's something that we talk about quite a bit, the transition from one leader to another, and particularly what that means for the person and their sense of identity. So Griff's experience is really going to be a prompt to help us reflect on our own organizations. Are we building structures that rely on a few individuals at the top, or are we fostering a culture where leadership is truly distributed? So with that, I'm going to hand to Dan for him to introduce himself.
G'day everyone, I am Dan Lake, based over in Dallas, Texas, originally from New Zealand, and I'm the global head of delivery for Adeption. And I've had the privilege of partnering with the group at DLR Group for, I think, the last 3 years in a leadership development program capacity, and learning from Griff as an executive sponsor in that program, and then seeing this opportunity here really to draw from his wealth of experience in that space of leadership transition, and kind of how can we get better? How can we think about this? And what can we do? So, Griff, I'd love to pass you a little bit of an introduction as we get going.
Sure. Thank you. And it's great to be here. I think one of the things that I really valued kind of as a cornerstone of my own development were these kinds of conversations with people, to really draw on the experiences of others, through as my own career was growing. But um, I won't go all the way back, but I graduated. I'm a University of Nebraska graduate, and really happy to see that crowd in the Sweet 16 next weekend, first time ever. But I'm an architect by training and by license. I've practiced architecture my entire career, until candidly I've evolved into some leadership roles that took me out of the day-to-day practice, so to speak. But I always had a goal of finding my way into the business end of architecture in the first place. And so really for the last 25 plus years of my career, I've really been involved in the business of design, spent some time in business development, spent some time in growing an office in Minneapolis, starting offices, closing offices, and then the last 15, 14 years of my career really in a driver's seat to help drive growth for DLR Group as CEO and managing principal. So it's been a very long and varied career. But I said one of the strengths I've always been able to share with young people is I think I've done just about everything they've been asked to do. And so I have some level of understanding and some ability to relate to even the youngest professionals joining our firm today. I refocused my career 2 years ago, 3 years ago, and began a transition with what is now our new CEO. And about 1 year ago, I stepped away from the organization as a full-time employee. And today I stay connected to the organization through my role as chairman of our board of directors. And as Dan alluded to, I work with our leadership development program. And to a certain extent, I'm still helping to advise a merger and acquisition program that's still pretty active as well. So definitely not employed full time any longer. I'm enjoying the next chapter of my life, but still staying in touch with the organization and providing whatever guidance that I can at this point to continue to help grow DLR Group.
Oh, that's wonderful, Griff. Thank you for the introduction. I want to ask you about something. So you said, you've done nearly every job there is to do at the company. So I want to take you back. You first joined DLR Group as an intern. You got to spend time with one of the founders. And I'm
Mhm.
really curious about what were some of the early leadership lessons that you learned, and how do you pay those leadership lessons forward?
Yeah, thank you. I was hired by Irv Dana, who was the original founder of our firm, and quickly turned over to another founder, Jim Rubel. And I worked very closely with. I was looking back, I was really very fortunate to have almost a day-to-day contact with Jim and Irv for a while as well. And I traveled with Irv, drove the car. It's one of those things that we used to do is before a lot of air travel in our business is we spent hours and hours and hours in cars together. And there's a couple things that happen there. It's really a captive audience, and it goes both ways. Irv and Jim would ask me how things were going, and I've always believed that it was really necessary to be as transparent as I could when they ask questions like that, and then the same way with them, and how did they get to where they are? Tell me the story about opening the office, and tell me the story about some of the early struggles with the economies and those kind of things. And so you learned a lot that way. And to answer your question, Corey, I've tried to engage with every level of organization through my whole career and do the exact same thing. There's always something to learn from every professional you touch base with. I think there's probably something I can share if they're willing to ask. I don't want to preach. I didn't make a career of preaching to people, but I wasn't afraid to have open and honest conversations about anything that they wanted to talk about. I go back and somewhere in maybe one of my LinkedIn descriptors is, Irv Dana taught me you don't really get anything in life unless you ask, and there's so much truth to that. And I remind people of that to be transparent with their needs as employees when you're talking to leaders. Don't make us guess what you think you want to do. We might think it might be good for you, but don't make us guess. And so every step of my career, I've asked, to be considered. I think I blew one of them away when I said, when they were looking at growing an office in Salt Lake City, and I said, I'll go to Salt Lake City. And they just responded to me like, nobody else has said that. And, part of being a success is doing something you really want to do in the first place. And so I've always kind of valued, a couple of moments like that in my career where I was just went out on a limb and said, this is kind of what I'd like to do. Same thing happened when I was in Salt Lake City after 4 years. And Bryce Pearsall, then one of the co-CEOs at the time, took me out to dinner and said, "How are things going?" And I took a little bit of a risk and said, "Well, they're going okay. I can probably earn you $250 million in fees every year for the rest of your life, but that won't make you happy, and it probably won't make me happy. So they're going okay." And about 2 weeks later, there was an opportunity to go open an office in Minneapolis. So sometimes just planting seeds through open and honest conversation, and I've tried to enable people to do that as I grew into more senior levels of roles, realizing that those were so valuable to my own career development. I can't help but think that would help others as they grow their own.
I really appreciate that. Um, Particularly the piece about, asking tough questions. How did you, especially early in your career, how did you lean into the confidence to be able to ask tough questions?
Well, I'm not sure I ever lacked confidence. I'm not a extrovert by any stretch. And so sometimes just, first of all, I'm watching some of the leaders around me and how they engage clients in difficult conversations or maybe uh, exploratory conversations. And I was able to apply some of that to my own thought as I was talking to my own leadership, or even as I was talking to emerging clients that I was beginning to earn too. There's a lot of questions. You can learn so much just by asking questions. And I keep telling people, you can lead a lot, candidly. You can learn a lot by just asking questions and being really curious. And I've always been fairly curious. And help people, I try not to bag people into corners with their answers, is, share with me some scenarios that you might consider. And so that there's no one answer that's right, but it might fuel two or three responses that might be good. I can remember asking Bryce one time, as a young architect, tell me about investing in the organization, and when were you done investing in the organization? And I'm not sure I knew the answer, and I do today. And his answer to me was, well, you never will really stop investing in investing in yourself, investing in the organization. And so there sometimes just those questions took a conversation in a lot of different directions. So don't know if I answered your question.
Oh, it's so good. I want to touch on something when you were answering Corey's question, just around kind of taking us through some of those early lessons that you've drawn on, and the growth that you've had in your career to now be chairman of the board, the sort of 2000% growth that you took the firm through, or led the firm through, in your time as CEO. And a lot of people build their identity in kind of being the doer, being the decider. And you said, hey, a couple of years ago, I transitioned myself. There's a new CEO. I've stepped and made a change. And so just kind of curious, what was one of the harder parts of letting go, or reshaping your rubric around kind of that internal metric of what a successful day means now?
Yeah, first of all, maybe I can answer the last question. I still measure my success in my role as chairman, or my role as in the leadership development program, or my role in acquisitions. Are they successful? The company has its metrics. I think even an acquisition has its metrics, probably more culturally than anything, in the first 2 or 3 years that maybe first 2 years that I'm involved in. And certainly, as we do our leadership development program, I think there's a certain level of success that, as an executive sponsor, that I can see, are people engaged? Are they responding to this? Are they showing up to these things? Are they bringing value? Is it part of the conversation offline when we're not in the adoption program? So I still measure myself, that way. Um, the forgot about the first part of your question.
So one of the hardest part of letting go there,
Yeah,
around you're
I
full time, you're CEO, you're on the road, you're traveling. Now
constantly,
what?
constantly, and I think, for me, um, I won't call it a soft landing, but when we decide to make the transition, you just use the word "we" again. It was totally my choice, but I really felt transition was going to have to take some time, and we spent uh, 6 months really putting together a game plan for what transition might look like, not for who was going to be involved in it. As far as a new CEO is going to be, because there was a process of selecting a new CEO, but what would it feel like on the other end? And, you know, who would we involve along the way? And, we chose to, I'm going to give you the long answer to your short question. We chose to develop a few peers, and bring some peers along with me as we discussed a 2-year journey for how I would transition from CEO to retired, or to chairman of the board in this case. And it did a couple of things. It brought, a small group of people along the way. And I think they really trusted the process that we all came up with. It wasn't just my game plan or what I wanted to do, it's what we were going to do together that was going to be to the benefit of the firm. And in doing so, I built a lot of trust with the leaders that were going to be sticking around after me in active operational roles. And so, um, it it didn't, to answer your question, Dan, it wasn't a giant adjustment for me the day we announced Steve as the new CEO. I'd already mapped that, and I knew that that was the day in the journey that we would all endure. I think to be real specific, it's really hard some days. There have been a few times where I see something happen in the organization, and it's really hard to just bite my tongue and talk to my wife about the options and scenarios, and she'd remind me about, you stepped back for a reason. And I think even as chairman, we have an unusual board structure, maybe for some, because four of our seven board members are active employees, including the CEO. And so it's really a slippery slope for us, as we can sometimes get into operational conversations that really transcend what the board should really be doing. And so it's been a little bit of a challenge to me to help, pull us up out of those rabbit holes sometimes when we want to talk about an office or a sector or a profit center in more detail than what the board really should be doing. And again, maybe the structure of our board is not an operational board. We do approve a business plan. We do have some say into some of the mergers and acquisitions that we do, and large expenditures of time and money and those kind of things. But day-to-day operations, our board just does not get into doing that. We don't write the business plans. We review the business plans that have been done by an executive team and others. And I think that also is maybe, Dan, it's made it a little bit easier for me to step away too, because I was neck deep in all those operational things for, since 2003 as a managing principal, and 2013 as a CEO. And to be able to be not involved in those, it's almost enabled me to be able to ask some of the tough questions that maybe I was blind to when I was in the middle of it. So I'd like to think in some ways that's helping the organization.
What I love about your answer there, Griff, and so appreciate hearing that, is your comment around that transition being really thoughtful, really intentional, and very much what do we want this to look and feel like on the other end? And having done that work of kind of how do we want this to feel, or what do we want this to look like, then the almost working backwards so we can work forwards into that space of I'm not surprised on day one of an announcement or a transition sort of moment. I love that framing around kind of how do we want this to look and feel. Corey, what's coming to mind for you?
Yeah. So this is so great, Griff. And thank you to those of you already putting questions in the chat. We'll get to those in a couple minutes. Here's my question. DLR has an expectation of collaboration. This is something that many of our client organizations are struggling with. How do you break down silos? How do you tap into diverse perspectives so that you can come up with the best solution? And Griff, how do you balance collaboration with decisive action? That's what I'm curious about.
Sure. I think, collaboration, we've always said design is a team sport. And the very best design work that our firm has done has been put together by a group of people, whether it be a group of architects or engineers or interiors people. There's just no one black cape, that shows up and waves the magic wand and gets it all right. That just doesn't happen. Are too complex. Owners are too complex. Owner groups need different personalities to talk to, and so that's really at the core of why we believe a collaborative process is really really necessary. It's partly our business and just partly the way we do business as well. I do think every project, every decision has to have a timeline. And, one of the things I always ask when I was even putting agendas together is how long do we want to allow this conversation to happen? And sometimes I would just suggest, why don't we give ourselves, 3 days for input or 2 weeks for input or whatever would seem okay for these. And, one of the things that I tried to do as a leader, I traveled a lot at the time. We had, in the 20s, I think we're over 30 offices now. I don't know if Steve does it. But, whenever I get out there was always partly a mission of some topic that had to be gone over with an office. I'd always try to have an open mic type of an opportunity, a fireside chat, we call them now, or a place for people to just ask questions off the cuff. And we're doing this, to connect us and to be part of us, kind of fuel that collaborative fire, if you will. Some great ideas coming from different parts of the countries and different parts of the geographies. But I just think it builds trust and opening up those lines of communications too. So I think to answer your question, as long as you start this whole collaborative process with the end goal that you know when the decision needs to be made or know what the outcome needs to be, or you'd like to think this, suspect where the outcome is going to be, and part of the conversation is just even validating where you're headed. You've engaged a whole bunch of people in the decision-making process, and it's just a whole lot easier to get things done when we're all moving in the same direction and people have been given an opportunity to kick the can, so to speak. And versus, and you all know them, there are companies out there where the CEO is a dictator, and the idea comes floating out there and says we're going this way Tuesday, and that just is not well received. I mean, we've had a few examples of that ourselves, then where we've had to learn the lesson that we're better off having that collaborative dialogue, that teamwork dialogue to build to a decision, but we never lose sight of when the decision must be made so that it can impact our business in a positive way.
That's really good. Um, it makes me think, your comment of sort of leaders by virtue of role saying, well, I've got this title, I've got this position, therefore decision made, we're going in this direction. And to your point, that's not often effective, or sometimes is a little bit removed from an awareness of kind of where the org or kind of team is at. And so just curious on how, or if you have a story of really leveraging trust, like social capital, to move something forward that really had nothing to do with sort of role or title, and how that then influenced others around you, that sort of succession planning build, but not just your decision, but where did you see kind of the fruit of that in later leaders or across the firm?
Wow, there's a lot there. Um, I really think sometimes, as we went through some difficult economic times or um, we're struggling from a business standpoint, even in good times, all of that collaboration and honest collaboration builds trust amongst so many people. And I call it leadership capital. And, every now and then you have to be able to call in some of that when you need some extra effort or need a new focus for the organization. We've done that a couple of times where we struggled for a while with flexible work week, and that's been along since COVID, right? And none of us really knew where that was going, but as we came back together, people were all doing their own flexible hours. Um, we thought we were struggling with productivity, and that's a really sensitive subject for people because some people, when you talk about productivity, you're saying work harder. And that's not at all what I was trying to say. I was trying to say we've got to meet some deadlines, meet our client goals. We can't want projects can't wander forever. We make money moving projects forward, and so to be able to sit down 300 principals on a Zoom call and say, "I need your help," and to begin to think about our project schedules this way, think about where we're putting our time and where we're putting our focuses as leaders, so that we can improve our productivity. That's a really difficult conversation. And I think, again, probably couldn't have happened had we not built the leadership capital for years ahead of that time, so that we finally have a moment in time where I'm going to ask something special and difficult. It could be executed. And we did have a positive result out of that. Yeah, there's always going to be people at the corner who are going to interpret that as just, Griff just said, work harder. But then more people said, no, I think we heard the right thing. How we get our work done is really up to other people. It's not up to me. So anyway, that's just one example, Dan, of I think just building that leadership capital, using collaboration to build that, building trust to build through collaboration to enable some of those things to happen.
I love that. I so appreciate that.
Riff, one of the things that's also in my mind, because DLR Group is very clear about leadership expectations, what the culture of the company is. One of the things that's been important is a listen first approach. So I'd love to hear, actually, if you have a story about um, maybe a time that you didn't put that into place and what the impact was.
Mm.
And then also, just the upside of that. How did a listen first approach impact DLR Group's bottom line?
Well, I can only respond maybe in a couple of different ways. Listen first is something I really try to, if there's anything I preach, it might be listen first. Somebody said years ago to me, you have two ears and one mouth, use them proportionally. And I think there is so much truth to that. And I built a career in the boardroom I'm going to call myself an introvert to a certain extent. Um, but I was always the last person to speak, and maybe even I am today, if I wasn't the chairperson. But I think there have been a lot of examples where I'll just let the personalities duke it out, and I've tried to do a good job at trying to coagulate, if you will, all of the ideas that I think have been floating around the room. Um, and that's, I think, paid dividends not only inside the organization, but even with our clients. I think some of our clients would say, why do you hire us? And many of my clients would say it's because you came to listen to us, whether it was a community group design. I did a lot of schools and we worked with a lot of public entities that, for those of you in and around the business, there's a lot of public entities that just feel like they need to be driving. And, I think they need to have a voice, a meaningful voice in the design of a school or design of a church or design of a public facility, but you can't really let them drive it or it might not ever get done. And so, but I do think people have, you asked me about the bottom line. I think a lot of the work that we continue to get as a firm is that we listen first. In fact, if you go digging into some of our company mantras, listen, design, deliver, we really take that very seriously. I took it very seriously. And I think without that component, we might not be the firm that we are today. Um, if people want our opinions, we'll give it to them. There's a time and a place for it, but I think I'm really proud of the design teams today that have really embraced this whole business of listening first and then, applying it to the execution or design work.
I love that. I'm curious if we kind of narrow in on succession. And one of the things that I've seen leaders sometimes get stuck on is they're wanting to have somebody be in the wings. They're wanting to have a sort of successor ready to go. They're not ignorant of the question of what if, and yet sometimes they get stuck on the person or people that I had in mind don't lead the same way that I do. They don't operate the same way that I do. And so that almost becomes a little bit of a barrier to them. And so I'm curious just on your thoughts on kind of leadership succession or transition where the how of that next leader is maybe fundamentally different than your how, but you're looking for that through line of the why remains the same.
Yeah.
Uh, and any sort of thoughts there? What can we do as leaders to look for that, to recognize it, to navigate it?
Well, I think, first of all, you have to have, we went through, rather than naming people to our list, we started by naming and developing a list of traits that we were going to be looking for in our next leader. And I say we, I was a participant, but I was not directly involved in the selection of our last of the new CEO. I helped review the traits that I thought would be applicable. Um, and so we started with that. I would also offer that I think part of the role as a leader is to take people, kind of meet people where they're at. And in our case, Steve was an extraordinary designer, and just very, very different than I was. But he had a passion for what he still does have a passion for design, but he had a passion for design that was just stood head and shoulders above other folks in the organization. He also led some groups of people, and you start looking for people that are leading groups of people who have groups of people that are following them. And so, we all have had then, and we still have now a succession plan, if you will, that is built up of a laundry list, of candidates that we think hold potential. And I think part of our job is to provide them opportunities to expand their horizons within the roles that they have. And so, Steve, can we help you, explore the business of design more than the design of design? Others, can we have you explore design more than the business of design? And so, can we start building some complementary practices by just engaging people in different roles of the organization? Um, so I came out of a business development background. That was really, and I opened an office but I hired great designers. I wasn't doing great design. So I think it's important that you really look at the traits you're looking for in people. Who is believable, who's living our core values, and that was really important to everybody. You touched on it earlier. We set a set of design or of leadership expectations. Those are being actively measured. I wouldn't say that those are new in the last 6 years that we 6, 7 years now that we've actually written those down and measured people by how well are they um, performing, how well are they contributing to those design expectations, firm first and others. But and you keep track of all of that. But at the end of the day, when Steve was ultimately selected, and I wasn't part of that. I was part of hearing a recommendation that Steve should be our CEO, and I didn't disagree. But the first thing I said to people, one of the first things I said to people is Steve is going to be different. He will speak to you differently than I spoke to you. And that is okay because we're all after the same thing. And we have Steve will come at leadership from a different perspective. He's from Scotland. He's got more design stories than I ever had. And I think that's okay. And it takes a little while for the organization to feel that, but I think as long as they see the leadership expectations and they see the company values being met and they maintain, there's a couple of non-negotiables, transparency, listen first. I think things have gone very well. But that's how we got through transition, Dan. I probably rambled a little bit longer than I should have there, but it's it was a process. And there were a lot of people that we looked at. And my own belief is that with the company the size we have today, that we really should never have to go outside the organization for another CEO or another executive. In a perfect world, you'd like to think that you're constantly evaluating those people and giving them opportunity to expose themselves, to take on more. And candidly, by listening to people, you hear what they want to do next. What do they want to do next? So,
Thanks for that, Griff. And it reminds me back to, the lesson you shared with us at the beginning about you always thinking about what might I want to do next, and let me say yes and let me put myself forward for that. Talking about transitions, Pamela, you had asked a question. What was the most difficult leadership transition, Griff, that you went through from an identity perspective? Why was it difficult? And what made the difference in helping you successfully make the transition?
well, I'll answer the last question first. I think sometimes, absence makes transition happen. And that's not a cop out to say just walk out of the room and leave, throw the keys at somebody else. Um, I think that might be the most difficult transition I had. I started the Minneapolis office in 1989. We did an acquisition in the early 2000s, and I had transitioned by agreement the office leadership to another individual. And it's something you've kind of put your heart and soul into. In our locations, an office leader really is involved in building the culture, helping to hire the people, nurturing, the work that's flowing through the office, being the head cheerleader. Um, I knew that I couldn't continue to take that front seat and do all of that, or the new leader would have zero luck. And so one of the things that I did right, wrong, or indifferent is I spent more time figuring out when I needed to be in the room versus when I didn't need to be in the room. And I literally just stepped away from office leadership meetings, or the Monday morning principals meeting. I like there were times when I could be a part of it, but now I'd also, by the way, I'd been asked to take on some other things inside DLR Group, and I just didn't want people always looking at me for the answer for something was happening in Wisconsin or Minnesota. And I really felt like I helped the person by stepping away. And that doesn't mean I didn't care, because I'd ask Tom or Matt, what can I help you with, behind the scenes. We'd go have a beer or meet privately if there's something they needed help with. But I that was your question was, what did I struggle with? That was what I struggled with, because um, it really is still important to me. I mean, it's kind of to a certain extent one of your kids that grew up, right? And you got to let them find their own feet, but you can't constantly be around propping them up. And so I still work that way. And if Kate in Minneapolis has questions and concerns, I'm always there, but I'm not going to be the person that says go left anymore. That was hard for me. And but I feel comfortable in my new role. And the good news is I think everything else is going just fine as a result. So
There's another question in the chat that I'm really curious about. Amy asked a really good question about a kind of pipeline succession, not so much at very senior roles, which maybe you have a different sort of rubric for, or sort of metric, but maybe some of those roles where there's a lot of standardization, or there's a lot of sort of think early associates. You've got
yeah,
your earlier grad sort of people, but you do end up with some turnover, or you end up with people
yeah,
exploring their lives, and you need a succession plan. And so what
yeah,
have you found or seen that has been really helpful at some of those kind of the first 10 years of someone's career, and
yeah.
from a firm perspective, needing a sort of systematic approach to succession planning there?
Um, Again, part of this is just being curious and allowing people to be curious. I really enjoy being around young people who are curious, people that ask me a ton of questions. It's a little flattering, but I think it works both ways. I mean, they're learning what I do. Maybe I've been asked a lot of questions about my own path. Maybe they can see themselves in one piece or other pieces of my path. And I really think that helps. Um, and so I've really encouraged others to do it as well. I mean, to your point, when, a grad comes out of school, and we're still very much an apprentice like practice, or industry, if you will. Disappointing, but it is what it is. Where, it's at least 3 or 4 or 5 years before someone can really get their license and become, call themselves an architect. We can put them in proposals, and they can move forward with maybe some other leadership roles in the company. So how do you keep that pool of two, three, four, 500 young individuals kind of jacked up about being in the organization? I think you have to meet them at their own level. What interests them the most? The ones that have a real interest in sustainability, you've got to point them in the directions of places where they can talk about sustainability, people that are interested in interior design, you have to kind of point them to their study groups, if you will, their peer groups who are doing interior design, or people that are highly technical. And there are, God help us, we need all of those people in the organization to just know how the nuts and bolts of a building go together. It's important that we match them up with people so they can kind of see that they can find their own career path doing what they feel like they enjoy the most. And I think it's just a constant effort. Um, I've always said somebody that's willing to share with me what they're looking for, it's pretty rare they leave. Now, I will tell you, before we got into healthcare, I used to get some young people to say, I really want to get into healthcare. There's not much I could do other than point them to a friend of mine who's looking for healthcare architects, right? That's not the case for us anymore. But I think those are the disappointing ones where you just see how good that person's going to be, and you see them grow, and we keep track of them. I do. And who knows, maybe as their career grows, there'll be another opportunity to have them boomerang and come back. But I don't know. I think it's just been important to meet people at their level and get a feel for what they were looking for, what they want to do with their career, how do they define success. I'll tell a funny story. It was the principal that I was working with. He knew that I'd come to work, and this is going to date me, but when we're making 10, $12,000 a year in 1980, and we were all struggling, and I'm sure uh, people in entry level are still struggling today. I get that. But I had somebody say to me, one of the principals say to me, in the next 5 years, when your income doubles or triples, you're gonna be a great place. And my eyes lit up big. If you look back to that conversation, he painted a picture that I needed to hear. He knew that that was something that was important to me, making a living. And rather than going elsewhere and looking for another dollar in salary or something like that, he gave me painted a picture for how I could not only do that, but what it was going to take to get there. And that meant the world to me. And so I've tried to do that with people as well, is paint the picture for what could be, paint the picture expectation. You want more money? Well, here's what needs to happen, and here's how I can help you get there. It's kind of a hand in hand. It's a two-way street. We can help a little bit, and going to need a little bit of your effort in a new way too. So I don't know. I guess, Dan, just meet people at their level, and I think it's done a good job at retaining people when we get our leaders doing that, um, and just building some really close relationships along the way. And we don't have a huge turnover. There's always some turnover, and we can't help it all. But for me as a leader, everyone who left always hurt. People would ask me sometimes as I grew up, you shouldn't expect to keep people for the life. I was with DLR Group 45 years. Not everybody's going to do that. I said, well, why not? Well, why not? And if we meet people at their own level and paint a picture of where their career could go and how they can be involved in kind of fashioning their own career, people should stay.
I love that, Griff. And I think it just gets back to that earlier conversation about building trust, being curious, asking powerful questions, so that people feel seen, they feel invested in, they see a future. Molly asked a great question that I think is related to this. Spotting and nurturing potential. How did you suss out a gut feeling that someone may have potential for more?
Well, that's a really good question. I always look for people that are curious. I looked at people for people that were successful in the little task, whatever task they may have been doing. I look for people that had a following. You can tell who goes to lunch, right? Are there people following? Um, and then, you know, to be able to corner them at a company outing, or sometimes it was a little intimidating, so I had to be a little careful, but to ask people what they wanted to do with their careers, um, and people that were willing to share that, or people that were willing to share what was happening with their families, etc. it built a relationship. And um, once you kind of get a hunch for people that they're, Jim Rubel used to say, they're just good people. Well, I don't know what quantified that, but you can kind of tell, and maybe it's the Midwestern person in me. You can kind of tell, and then I think it's up to us then to paint some pictures and maybe map some risk with people. I mean, DLR Group grew on a foundation of, I think pushing people out to do things that they weren't ready to do by any stretch of the imagination. I was asked to go to Salt Lake City to help open an office when I was 31 years old. Had just barely, let's see, no, not even that. I just barely, I was 20, 27, 28 years old and barely understood the business, much less how to run a practice. And all of a sudden, I'm part of an executive team running a Salt Lake City office, leading business development. I wasn't ready for that, but somebody thought I would be at some point in time. And so, pushing people to a place of, a modest level of discomfort is okay. And I think that's what we've tried to do with people to grow offices or grow sectors or grow teams is push them to a place where they're just modestly uncomfortable. Make sure that they're connected so that they don't completely fall. But I think you'll learn a lot by experiencing things that you don't have a ton of confidence in at the outset, whether it be opening an office in Minneapolis. I had never hired a person in my life, and all of a sudden I had to go hire and negotiate salaries, and that was a whole new world. And deal with insurance and all the things that no one had taught me about. And I look back and say, the company did the right thing by pushing me out there. I didn't have any preconceived notions. I didn't have any bad habits that way around those topics, and I was going to learn them along the way. And we've had some great success stories. Young guys that just came to me and said, someday when you decide to be in Houston, we want to go to Houston. And that was like a 4-year conversation. And one day we wanted to go to Houston. And I said, you guys want to go to Houston? It's time to go. And you just paint a picture for people and take notes of what they want to be doing. And, people stick around then. I don't know. Again, we had groups of people in Dallas, Houston, Denver, most recently Nashville, who had no clue how to run an office, zero. And they're among our most successful offices today in a period of, relatively short period of time, 5 and 10 years.
It's so good to hear some of these stories, and so your experience of uh, leaning into a wealth of curiosity in order to create opportunities for others, and by extension for the firm and yourself too. But
Exactly.
I'm curious on sort of the idea of decentralized leadership. DLR Group is not or doesn't strike me as a sort of traditional hierarchy driven. I'm at the top, and here's the pyramid. And not everybody who's listening to this is going to have a firm makeup or an organizational makeup that you were intentional around creating. So knowing that, I'm a little bit curious just on your thoughts on how do you decentralize leadership, even in regardless of your role, regardless of sort of what the makeup of an organization is, how do you empower people to take ownership, to decentralize that?
Well, you have to be real clear with the expectation, whether it's a role title. And, we've been a decentralized, if you look at our corporate structure, it's been decentralized for as long as I've been around. Um, you know, the three founders all started in Omaha, Nebraska, and it did not take long for someone to have to grow into Pierce, South Dakota, and Lewiston, Idaho, and Phoenix, Arizona. And there was no way in the world those three guys were going to end up with a successful business practices in some of those cities. Peer is a whole nother conversation. But I think today we've kind of valued this too. The second generation of DLR Group, really when the founders all retired and we bought them, became an ESOP. Bryce and Dale were decentralized also, the two managing principals, the co-CEOs, one in Phoenix, one in Omaha. And then, when that ultimately transitioned, I had watched decentralized leadership work. It was an expectation. I've said people years, we were sharing work around the company, and this will fall into a leadership category in a minute, before people really understood that we could share work. And so when I did Bemidji High School, and it was so big, we had three components of it, and the piece was going to be done in Phoenix, and the athletic piece was going to be done somewhere else, and the academic piece done in Minneapolis. And Dan, we could call each one of those, their project managers taking each one of those pieces. Well, those project managers were all in different parts of the world. And candidly, that was before the internet. And, we were on a phone call, how do you lead groups of people? Well, it's over communication. And so we had telephone lines, and FedEx was probably funded by DLR Group, in the early days, shipping drawings back and forth. But I think the common denominator in all this is really communicating, and willingness to communicate and recognize a simple fact that leadership can happen anywhere on the globe. And we're still experiencing that, is that it doesn't all have to be piled into one ivory tower. There are a lot of firms out there that, if you're going to advance, you got to move to New York, or if you want to advance, you got to move back to the mothership, in Omaha, or Los Angeles. And so we've just have really steered clear of that model, and taken the skill set, and some of it's leadership, some of it's design. I guess all of it's probably leadership of some sort, and put it to work wherever it is. And again, in the FaceTime and Zoom and connectivity that we all learned so well, I call it exemplified during COVID, is really core of what we're doing today. And we are able to, today, we're using decentralized leadership as part of our war on for the talent shortage we're all dealing with. I don't know what all industries you're all in, but the design industry is really dealing with a talent shortage. And so we've got to go find people wherever they can sit, and find the good ones, and put them together on meaningful teams, or start offices around them, et cetera. And we're doing all of that. And I think a company culture that has fully accepted, remote work, remote offices, remote teams, and remote leadership is part of what sits at our success today. Our CEOs in Seattle, our COOs in Kansas City, our CFO, brand new this week, is in Dallas, Texas. His mentor or predecessors sitting in Omaha, Nebraska. Our corporate comms people are in Kansas City. Our director of architecture is in design, is in Phoenix. And, our Monday morning meeting, it still is, I don't know if it's Monday morning anymore, I think it's Tuesdays or something, but is a group collaboration. Our executive team meets virtually. And we have our Tuesday morning meetings, and that team still has an agenda, and it gets together face to face, and it pushes the direction of the company forward. And so it does work. It does take a mindset that remote leadership can work. And it does work. It's not because it's not like we think of it as oh gosh, if we have to make it work, we will. We actively looked, I use our CFO as a good example. We went on a global search for a new CFO, and our accounting and CFOs have been in Omaha since the beginning of time. 60 years. And for the first time, that structure is leaving Omaha and going to Dallas. And in part, I think he will tell you that he was attracted to us by the decentralized leadership. And we were willing to go to Dallas with a fairly key function that is a big change for our organization. I guess time will tell whether that one specifically is going to work, but I think it's got a fair chance, and great leaders just know how to operate inside this decentralized model.
It's so helpful. And I love that link between succession planning and decentralized leadership, that you can be really intentional in both those spaces. So that was super helpful to
Absolutely.
hear.
I was just going to thank you, Griff, about the stories, the candor, the examples, um, and just the impact of a company with this much focus on leadership over decades, what's required, how do we need to lead in today's environment. I mean, it would have been unheard of years ago that the leadership team is not co-located. So really appreciate your examples, the call outs about trust and listening and investing in the next generation. Really want to say thanks to you. I'm going to hand it to Dan to give everyone an idea of what's coming next.
Absolutely. I just want to say thank you too, echoing Corey's thanks. Griff, thank you for your time, and a huge thank you to everybody that made time in your day, whatever your time zone is, wherever in the world you are. We are so glad that you have joined us for Global Chats this month. Our next one is going to be coming up in May, and a little bit of a mystery surprise guest. So be on the lookout for some new comms coming out soon, and an invite here for May, which will be warming up in North America, and I know cooling down in the APAC Southern Hemisphere. So wherever you are, we're wishing you a really fantastic week ahead. Thank you for your time, and yeah, so appreciate everybody that made time to be here today. So thank you, and stay well.
Thank
Take
you all.
care.